I was in my early 20s when I was still a relatively new staff member here at Cottonwood Church, and I was attending a kind of a prayer gathering. Basically, it was in this room. Actually, it was myself and a number of other staff members on our church, and we had got together to pray. And the meeting was going along, I guess, as usual, as you would expect a prayer gathering to go along. When all of a sudden, one of the pastors in the room, who I was not that close to at the time, I didn't know that well. One of the pastors kind of stood up in front of everyone and he said, "Hey, Anthony, I feel like I have a word for you. I feel like I have something that God wants me to say." And he went on to kind of just say some things that he believed, kind of talk about some things that he believed God had called me to in my life and reaffirm some things that I was already, I guess, aware of. In terms of, me believing like I was called into pastoral ministry and stuff. And he made a distinct point about how saying that like he believed that God was calling me to lead in different capacities. And a lot of what he said, it resonated really well with me. It actually resonated so well that when I left that meeting, I did not think, oh, that was so cool that so-and-so encouraged me. I actually walked away from that meeting believing, I think I heard God's voice. And I think God spoke to me through that encouragement. And then fast forward a couple years, and at this point, I'm in my mid-20s, I guess now. When this moment happened, I was in a conversation with a mentor, and in my life, I was actually doing a lot of the things that other guy had kind of believed I was going to eventually do. I was preaching more, I was leading more, I was kind of living out what I believed to be God's call on my life. But one of the things that I was secretly struggling with was this sense of like, hey, as a leader, I feel like I don't hear God's voice. I just feel like I know other guys who lead in different capacities in church context, and I when I look at them and I look at how they operate, I feel like I don't hear God speak to me the way God speaks to them. And I was having this moment where I was kind of venting my frustrations with a mentor of mine, and I was expressing, yeah, this is how I feel, and he was listening and he was offering comfort and guidance. When all of a sudden he kind of interrupted me, and he said, "Oh, wait, that's it right there. What you just said is, I think, what God is speaking to you." And he proceeded to kind of connect some dots about my life and about that time in my life. And he started to highlight some themes and some trends that I didn't even notice at the time. But by the end of our conversation, I realized, wait a second, maybe God actually has been speaking to me and I just didn't know how to look for it. And similar to the first example, when I walked away from that conversation with that mentor, I did not think, oh, that was really like helpful and that was good. I actually walked away thinking, I walked away and I was thinking, I think God spoke to me. I think I heard his voice through a person. And I share both of those examples because the thing that I want us to consider this morning is how we can actually hear God's voice coming through people. I'm gonna come back to those stories at the conclusion of our teaching, but those kinds of moments, they have happened to me a handful of times in my life. And I would argue that that's kind of how it's supposed to be. That from pastors to leaders, mentors, authors, even the occasional podcaster every now and then, that people are actually supposed to be one of the ways we hear God's voice. That as much as many of us would like signs or kind of some dramatic confirmation when we're trying to figure out, is God speaking to me? What is God saying to me? What is God telling me? Many of us would like kind of big, very clear, extravagant messages from God, but oftentimes God just puts regular people in our lives, people who are there to actually help us hear him. So the parent who can be annoying at times, the teacher who challenges you because they believe you have more potential, the youth leader who you don't quite vibe with all the time, but you know that they're always going to be there for you. In many of those cases, the people we have in our lives are actually designed by God to be sources of how we hear his voice if we can learn how to listen. And in order to explore this idea, I want to walk us through a passage, and it might seem like I'm going off topic for a little bit just because I kind of want to do justice to working our way through the passage. I promise you, by the end, we will get to an idea about learning how to hear God's voice together. Here's our passage for the day. 1 Corinthians chapter 14. Verses 1-3, it says this: "Follow the way of love and eagerly desire gifts of the Spirit, especially prophecy. For anyone who speaks in a tongue does not speak to people, but to God. Indeed, no one understands them. They utter mysteries by the Spirit, but the one who prophesies speaks to people for their strengthening, encouraging, and comfort." The opening line there, follow the way of love. It's actually a continuation of Paul's train of thought from right before this passage. So we started reading in chapter 14, but in chapter 13 of this letter, Paul just wrote a definition of love that is honest, it's still read at weddings all over the world today just because of how good it is. 1 Corinthians 13 is where we get this famous poem. Some of us would be familiar with it. It says this: love is patient, love is kind. It does not envy, it does not boast, it's not proud, it does not dishonor others, it's not self-seeking, it's not easily angered, it keeps no record of wrongs. Love does not delight in evil, but it rejoices with the truth. It always protects, trusts, always hopes, or it always trusts, always hopes, always perseveres. Love never fails. Now, as beautiful as that poem is, Paul is not just a romantic person who wanted to write a poem. If you read the flow of 1 Corinthians, Paul's actually trying to address problems in a church. It's as if someone got on stage and said, hey, here's a problem and I want to address it in our community. There are several indications in the letter of 1 Corinthians that make it seem like the church he's writing to was a very spiritually gifted church. Paul mentions gifts such as speaking in tongues, healing, miracles, and so forth. Their worship services seem to be kind of a whole experience. And Paul writes to them to ensure that they're not missing the point. That beyond powerful worship and spiritual moments, God actually wants to make clear what matters most for this community. Now, as you can see, I started reading in verse 4 of chapter 13. Back up 3 more verses just so you can see how he starts. Paul writes this: if I speak in the tongues of men or of angels, but do not have love, I am only a resounding gong or a clanging cymbal. If I have the gift of prophecy and can fathom all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have a faith that can move mountains but do not have love, I am nothing. If I give all I possess to the poor and give over my body to hardship that I may boast but do not have love, I gain nothing. Now, his goal here is really not to devalue things like speaking in tongues, giving a prophecy, or giving to the poor. It's quite the opposite. Paul values all of those things that he listed, but he wants to encourage this church to check their motivations. Why are you actually doing the things that you're doing? If he were writing to our culture today, he might say something like this: if I regularly attend church, read my Bible and pray, but don't have love, then I'm just going through the motions of religion. If I become talented, educated, and successful, but don't have love, then I'm going to end up empty and shallow. If I live my life to impress others and get influence, but I don't have love, then I may gain the whole world and lose my soul. Essentially, what Paul is trying to say here is that growth in the Christian life is always going to look like love. Love for God and love for others. And it can be really tempting for those of us who follow Jesus to start to evaluate ourselves based on things like how much we sin or how much we know the Bible. And those things, they matter. But the primary metric for Paul is love. Are we actually, for those of us who are Christians and trying to follow Jesus, are we actually becoming more kind, more forgiving, more compassionate, more generous, or are we maybe missing the point? So he says, follow the way of love and eagerly desire gifts of the Spirit. Back in chapter 12, Paul actually gives a list of some of these gifts, and I'm not going to go through them right now. I've mentioned this before, but our founding pastor, Pastor Bayless, he has a whole series on YouTube on the gifts. I think it's actually from that 1 Corinthians chapter 12 passage. But what I want us to notice is that in verse 1, he says, eagerly desire the gifts. The original language that this letter was written in was in Greek, and in Greek, the word eagerly is not there. But we add it in English because the Greek word for desire, it's so strong that it implies a passionate pursuit of something. It's as if Paul is saying, hey, I want you to chase these spiritual gifts. I want you to prioritize them, and I want you to go after them, especially prophecy. Goes on, verse 2, for anyone who speaks in a tongue does not speak to people, but to God. Indeed, no one understands them. They utter mysteries by the Spirit, but the one who prophesies speaks to people for their strengthening, encouraging, and comfort. Now, this message is not on the topic of speaking in tongues, but I will say our church does value the practice. If you keep on reading in this chapter, Paul will encourage everyone in Corinth to pray in tongues. And since I'm just kind of plugging Pastor Bayless's resources this morning, he has a book on the subject that we literally give away for free at our prayer tent out on the plaza if you're interested. But for the purpose of this sermon, I want to draw our attention to how Paul describes prophecy in verse 3, because it has some implications for how we hear God's voice. He says the one who prophesies speaks to people. So notice, it is one person speaking to another person for their strengthening, encouraging, and comfort. When some people think of prophecy, they might think of like fortune telling, as if prophecy is about predicting the future or saying what's going to happen. And there is some of that in the biblical narrative, but the kind of prophecy that we see most often in the Bible, and definitely the kind of prophecy that's championed in the New Testament church, it's not so much about predicting the future as it is about simply hearing and speaking a message from God to someone else. You may remember that in week 1 of the series, we looked at this passage in Hebrews. It says, in the past, God spoke to our ancestors through the prophets at many times and in various ways. So notice, the way God used to speak to people all throughout the Old Testament was through prophets. Of the 39 books in our Old Testament, the last 17 of them are by prophets. And there are several other prophets that are mentioned throughout the storyline. The prophets were the people who spoke to the nation of Israel on behalf of God. God would speak to one person, and that one person would communicate a message to another person or to a group of people. And the obvious question there is, why? God, why not just speak directly to the people that you want to speak to? And the answer there is a little multi-layered, but I at least want to point out one truth about God that we can learn from this setup. And that is that God likes to partner with people. The reason God doesn't just audibly speak to your friend is because perhaps God actually wants to speak to you and have you speak to your friend because he wants to partner with you. This goes all the way back to the Garden of Eden when God creates humanity, and you may remember what he tells humanity is, I want you to rule over creation. God doesn't need any help ruling over creation. Rather, he creates humanity because he just wants to share his power and his purpose with people. Part of what it means to be made in the image of God is someone who reflects God, like someone who works with God on behalf of God. This is exactly why God uses people like Moses and Miriam to free the Israelites from slavery in the book of Exodus. God could have just done it himself. He's the one who performs all the miracles, but God wanted to include people in his plan. This is why Jesus recruited disciples and then sent them out to preach. Jesus doesn't need any help preaching. But God likes to partner with people, and it's actually through this act of prophecy that God still partners with people today. Notice how the author of Hebrews said that God used to speak through the prophets. In the past, God spoke through the prophets, but Paul tells all Christians in Corinth to pursue prophecy. Because if you follow the biblical storyline, prophecy was once reserved for a select few, but after Jesus' death and resurrection, he now gives his spirit to all who sign up to follow him. So the same spirit that once empowered the prophets to speak on behalf of God is now supposed to be available to all people, which is why Paul writes, eagerly desire prophecy. To ask God for the ability to hear his voice and then to speak it on behalf of others. And this is why any conversation about hearing and discerning God's voice, it would be incomplete if we only talked about hearing God for ourselves. If we only talked about hearing God so that God could give us more guidance and more direction, we might be missing the point, because right here, the scripture encourages us to pursue the ability to hear God's voice so we could share it with others. Which leads to some practical considerations for us. Number one is this: if God speaks through people, then we should have a team of trusted voices. In the corporate world, businesses will often have what's called a board of advisors, which is a group of people that offers direction and advice for a company as they're making decisions. Because honestly, whether you look at churches or companies, nonprofits, organizations, sports teams, whatever it is, smart humans have all figured out what the Bible said thousands of years ago, that in an abundance of counselors, there is safety. And if you think about it, and to be honest, I don't know how long it takes in life to realize this. For some people, this becomes clear at 16. For other people, it becomes clear at 46 because they're slow learners. But some of our worst decisions in life are decisions that we made all by ourselves. They're decisions that we didn't talk to anyone about because we didn't want advice. We just wanted to do what we wanted to do, which is actually fine if you don't care about hearing God's voice. But if the goal is to get better at hearing and discerning the voice of God, then why would we not create a team of people who we can go to for guidance? And the goal here is not to outsource responsibility to others. Just because someone is a Christian leader, that does not mean they're perfect, nor does it mean that their words are always from God. But the goal here is to consider the ways that God speaks so we can grow in our ability to hear him. And people are one of the ways that God speaks. So who's on our team? Who are the family members, pastors, leaders who we can go to when we are trying to discern God's voice? And are we actually including them in the process? And then here's the second point of application this morning. First point was that we should have a team of trusted voices. Second point is this: if God speaks through people, we should practice partnering with God. Or in the language of our passage, we should eagerly desire the gift of prophecy. We should seriously pursue hearing God's voice, not just so we can make better decisions and feel more secure, but we should pursue hearing God's voice so we can share it with others. And I think far too often, it is really easy to settle for a version of ourselves as Christians that is actually below what Jesus intended for us. Like, if I could just get better at recognizing God's voice, well, then I wouldn't doubt myself. Then I would know my career, and I know my calling, and I know my direction. Then, so many of the problems in my life would go away. And like, maybe some of that has warrant. But even then, the goal in life is not just for us to thrive in life. The goal is becoming people of love, to become the kinds of people who can speak to others for their strengthening, encouraging, and comfort. Now, depending on our spiritual background, we may think that prophecy is something that we'd be willing to try, or we have such a sensationalized view of it that it seems way out of reach. But that's why I opened up with those stories from my own experience, because I would categorize both of those stories that I opened up with as people prophesying over me. One happened because a guy was just listening for God's voice in prayer, and he felt like God told him to encourage me. The other was a regular conversation where I was venting my frustrations to a mentor. And as he listened to me, he offered words of guidance that God used. And the point is that they were both relatively regular moments where someone else just took the initiative to share something comforting and encouraging, and that's something we can all do. There definitely is a version of Christianity where people can get weird and a little over the top about the practice of prophecy, but that's not really something I'm worried about for our community. Rather, my concern is that we become so focused on hearing God's voice for ourselves that we neglect the practice of listening for others. Because God doesn't just want to speak to us, he also wants to speak through us. So in an attempt at being really practical here, I'm just gonna suggest really quickly a template for how we can actually practice hearing and sharing God's voice on behalf of someone else. And it's really straightforward. Desire, ask, encourage, guard. When someone prophesies over another person or to another person, they do not go into a trance. They are not taken over by God, which means this is not something that we should just wait around for. Rather, when someone receives what we would call prophetic word, it starts with them desiring and asking God to give them a word to encourage someone else with. And this is why Paul said to eagerly desire this gift, because like so many other things in the Christian life, God's not gonna force it on us. So it actually starts with our desire and our prayer request that God would use us in this way. And then we can practice by just being encouraging. Before God gives us words to share, we should practice using our own words to highlight the good things in the people around us. And if I'm being honest, this is something that I'm really trying to get better at, is actually just saying the positive things that I notice about others. But the other side of the coin is also important here. Not only should we practice encouragement, but we should also practice guarding our words. The Apostle James criticized Christians who use their words to praise God in one moment and then curse humans in the next. And if we want to be people who speak on behalf of God, we cannot be people who carelessly use our words to talk bad about or tear others down. Desire, ask, encourage, guard. Like anything else in life, the longer we practice this, the more we'll learn and the more we'll grow. But I want to end with this, and Melissa, I'll have you come up and play the keys. My big idea for today, which is actually not going to be on the screens, but the fundamental thing I hope we walk away with is that God can speak to us through people, and God can speak to people through us. God can speak to us through people, and God can speak to people through us. And as much as I hope that we all have some people in our life who can help us hear and discern God's voice, pastors, leaders, mentors, parents, family members, like even just friends who are wise and trustworthy, I would also hope that we are becoming people who practice simple things like praying for our friends, giving encouragement, and maybe, just maybe, people who God doesn't just speak to, but God speaks through. And this is the part that I wanted to highlight. The reason this matters is because we all know so many people. As a matter of fact, some of us are those people. We all know so many people who go through life and everything on the outside looks fine. And on the inside, they are broken and they're hurting and they're wondering what is next for them, and they don't see a long path in their future. And it's one thing for someone to come to church and to hear a pastor say, hey, God loves you, like Jesus sees you. But it's a whole other thing when someone else in their life says something as simple as, hey, I was thinking about you. Hey, I was praying for you. And I just felt like God reminded me, or wanted me to remind you, he sees you. He loves you. I can only wonder how many people in our lives we could affect positively by becoming the kind of people who don't just listen for God to speak to us, but by becoming the kind of people who listen for God to speak through us. How many people could be encouraged? How many people could be helped? How many people could have hope that they don't currently have? Because we did the simple process of desiring, asking, encouraging.